Thank you very much, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to take a call in this committee stage of the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Bill. You may be asking why I'm standing up and taking a call in this debate at all, but as Mr Brownlee will know, I'm a former Christchurch boy myself and proud Crusader supporter, and very interested, as well as Hurricanes, and very interested in the goings-on in Christchurch. I grew up in the fine suburb of Hoonhay, which my colleague Megan Woods, who's sitting to my right now, is the representative of. But it's an interesting life that this bill has had since it was introduced to this Parliament. I think it was late last year. At first reading, it got support to Select Committee, but it had a rocky time at the Select Committee, and well, to a degree, Mr Brownlee. But then, with some work from Mr Brownlee and my colleague Megan Woods, it has arrived back in the House in a much better state than it was when it came from the Select Committee. And one of the reasons for that, as some speakers have spoken to already in this debate on part one, is that there is going to be a lot more input from the Christchurch community in itself in this next phase of the recovery for Christchurch. I think it's been a well-spoken criticism that as we get to this regenerate stage of Christchurch's rebuilding, that there has been a lot of Wellington-focused decision-making, and that not enough has come from grassroots people in Christchurch. And while those who are actively doing the building in Christchurch have got a fair bit to say about how things go there, the actual citizens for some time have been saying that not a lot of their voice has been heard. And in part one, as some speakers have said, in the purpose part of part one, 131C does enable community input in decisions on the exercise of powers under this regeneration bill. Further down in clause 3, Mr Chair, it also goes to say that in doing so, that the agencies concerned have to look at the environmental, economic, social and cultural wellbeing and resilience of the communities of Christchurch, which I believe is a good addition to this bill. Because of the concern that I raised earlier in my speech. I think, interestingly enough, there was a documentary on TV1 on the anniversary of the Christchurch earthquake, which I believe Mr Brownlee featured in. He may not have seen it when it went to air, but there was a considerable amount of comment in that documentary from, I would say, Mum and Dad Christchurch Cantabrians, who were concerned about the level or lack of the level of support or input that they were having into the Christchurch rebuild. But I think some of the changes that have been made with the input of opposition parties to this piece of legislation will enable them to have that voice through the enabling of the community input to the regeneration plan, and importantly, including those well-beings, the environmental, economic, social and cultural well-beings that have been explicitly put in this piece of legislation. Looking a little bit further down the line in part one, Mr Chair, to clause 11, where which is titled Conditions Applying to Exercise of Powers by the Minister or the Chief Executive. Within this piece of legislation, there are still massive powers that are held by the Minister who's sitting and the Chair and the heads of the agencies which are described in part one. And that is to acquire or to carve up or to sell off land that, one of the many powers anyway, to sell off land that may be needed as part of the regeneration. That is still, I think, a very hefty power in this piece of legislation, and one that I think will need a lot of oversight by us as opposition MPs and by my colleagues who are Christchurch-based MPs to make sure that what they are doing is within the realms of this piece of legislation. I think it is a carryover power from the SERA legislation that was passed very speedily and needed to be passed very speedily in the moments after the February earthquake. But because it is a carryover power, it doesn't necessarily mean that the level of critique that on this side of the House we will need to pay attention to some of the decisions that get made by the Minister and also by the agency, Mr Chair, by the agencies concerned. Because we could see, I guess the worst case scenario is the mandatory acquisition of land taken for the purpose, not necessarily that is best for that land, and we'll keep an eye on things like that. There is an SOP under the name of my colleague Dr Megan Woods, which will amend clause 4 in part 1, which will insert the Hagley Park Management Plan into this piece of legislation. That will go in some way to protect Hagley Park from the kind of acquisition that I've spoke to just before the bell went. And I think as a Cantabrian who grew up playing cricket and rugby at Hagley Park, I know how important a resource and actually a jewel it is for the people of Christchurch to make sure, make sure explicitly in this piece of legislation that Hagley Park, as it stands now, is protected, I think is a very good SOP. And I think as people not from Christchurch will realise if they have travelled to Christchurch just how important Hagley Park is. When Lancaster Park, or I think it was AMI Stadium, when it during the February earthquake was hit and then therefore rendered not usable, Hagley Park became the sporting centre, well the cricket sporting centre anyway, for Christchurch and for the Canterbury region. So I guess we do know the importance of Hagley Park. It holds not just the Hagley Oval, Hospital Corner is where they play cricket. I think it's South or North Hagley Park where rugby is held on a Saturday morning for little nippers like me. North? Both? Okay. Some cold mornings at Hagley Park had by some, and will continue to be as a bit of a rite of passage for Cantabrians who very well verse themselves on the rugby field when they get to senior levels. So I think to protect Hagley Park in that respect by Megan Woods is a very good amendment to this bill. Just wrapping up all those together, Mr Chair, it is a much better piece of legislation because of the intervention of not just the Minister but the opposition parties. It means that because of the involvement of those in the community, that we'll have a unified regeneration phase of Christchurch, at least at this start, at least at this point anyway. We would hope that because this piece of legislation has been improved and has got wide-ranging support from around this House, so the spirit of that will continue, not just in the legislative phase, but also in making sure that it is continued in the actual regeneration. And as we've said on this side of the House, we'll be keeping a close watch on that to make sure that the spirit of the law is continued. Thank you.
Mr Speaker.